Thanks, Jason. I'm sure a lot of you are aware that this whole carbon farming business is in the news a fair bit. It's a relatively recent thing, and I guess my presentation today is really to talk about a project that we're doing in this space in the pastoral production section of the department. A bit of background as to, I guess, what it's about and what it means for the pastoral industry in the territory and the sort of work that we're doing in this project. So I'll give you a quick outline of what I'm going to talk about today. I want to put greenhouse gas emissions of the Northern Territory pastoral industry in some sort of context in an Australian and global scale. Give you a bit of an insight into why our department's researching carbon farming. The options that we're actually evaluating in conjunction with the Northern Territory pastoral industry and how we're actually doing that evaluation. I'll give you just, I guess, a few take-home messages about what our current recommendations are to the Northern Territory pastoral industry about carbon farming, and a bit of an insight into where we're going, I guess, in the next couple of years with an externally funded project that we have running. I guess the first fun fact is that more than 80% of greenhouse gas emissions in northern beef businesses are attributable to the cattle themselves. And when you see a fact like that, you sort of think, well, that sounds pretty bad, doesn't it? That's a big number, and therefore the cattle industry must be, I guess, a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions in this part of the world. However, when we put that into context, using some data from 2010-11, Australia overall, I guess, in all industries and sectors, emits about 562 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents per year, and that's about 1.5% of what they estimate is the global total of emissions. The Northern Territory emits about 14.7 million tonnes of this, and that's about 2.6% of Australia's total emissions. Agriculture is actually the biggest sector in the Northern Territory in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, and the agriculture sector emits about 8 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalents. However, the report, this Australian National Greenhouse Gas Accounts report, stated that the principal source of emissions from agriculture in the NT comes from savanna burning. I just wanted to point out that although savanna burning is incorporated in the agricultural emissions, a really large part of savanna burning emissions don't actually occur on agricultural land in the Northern Territory. So this is savanna burning across all tenures in the Territory, including the conservation estate and the Indigenous estate, even though it's included in agriculture. So if we put that into context, then NT emissions overall are less than 0.04% of global emissions. The cattle industry emissions in the Territory are therefore quite a small fraction of that. So 80% on a given cattle enterprise, 80% being attributed to cattle, 80% not much is still not very much. So of course that begs the question, why are we even talking about carbon farming and greenhouse gas emissions here in the Northern Territory, let alone in the Northern Territory pastoral industry? Well, there's a few reasons. Firstly, we currently do still have a carbon tax in Australia. So people or businesses, companies that emit a certain amount of emissions are required to pay carbon tax on those emissions. And they're also looking at ways of offsetting that tax burden by buying carbon credits. So whilst we still have a carbon tax, there's going to be a demand for carbon credits in Australia. Agricultural overall is actually exempt from paying the carbon tax, so it's not included in that at the moment. However, a lot of the inputs that contribute to agriculture come from industries and businesses that do have to pay carbon tax, or whose input costs have also increased because of their suppliers having to pay the carbon tax. So agriculture has a lot of inputs such as fertilisers and animal supplements and things that will probably go up in price or have gone up in price because the suppliers have actually got a higher cost burden on them. And there's also, the other reason we're talking about it is that there's a package of incentives for agriculture to get involved in carbon farming and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And under the former federal government, this incentive package was called the Carbon Farming Initiative. And it's essentially trying to get to a point where agricultural industries can generate carbon credits and they can sell those credits to other sectors who have a carbon tax liability in order to offset that. And agriculture does cover a large proportion of Australia's landmass, and so there's theoretically quite a lot of opportunity for agriculture to generate these credits. The current situation with the new federal government's a little bit uncertain at the moment, but their policy is around what's something called direct action. And direct action, essentially, as I understand it, is going to be a package whereby they will pay successful tenderers for carbon credits produced. So an agricultural business, if they can put a successful tender document together to generate a certain amount of credits at a certain cost, then the federal government will pay them directly for those credits that are generated. So why are we actually doing a research project around carbon farming? Well, I guess the first thing is that the Northern Territory pastoral industry is under a bit of pressure at the moment, that the industry has got a lot of, I guess, concerns about market security and things like that, and cattle prices, the cost of production is actually going up. So cash flow in the Northern Territory pastoral industry is a bit grim for a lot of producers at the moment. So there may be opportunities for producers to actually use alternative methods to generate cash flow in their businesses. Now, whether carbon farming is one of these options available to them or not, they don't really know, and we don't really know. So part of the reason for us doing a project on this is to really find out whether this is an opportunity to generate cash flow in Northern Territory pastoral businesses, and if so, how the industry might go about doing it, and whether there really is a business case for them to get involved in this. So I guess there's a couple of things, a couple of premises or core things about our research project that I want to make clear. First of all, we're very much about the productivity benefits to the cattle business of carbon farming practices. And it just so happens that a lot of the practices that pastoralists can perform to improve productivity also have a spin-off for positive greenhouse gas emissions outcomes. But we're very much about the productivity benefits. It's no point reducing greenhouse gas emissions if the productivity of your cattle enterprise goes backwards and you go broke. So it's very much has to be a dual exercise. We're also taking a really unashamed acid test approach to this carbon farming business. We want to know, does carbon farming really pay? Does it generate significant benefits above business as usual in running your current enterprise? And is it even practical to do this carbon farming stuff as part of a cattle enterprise? So we're being very strict, I guess, about our criteria in terms of whether we can say, yes, there's a business case, or no, there's not. It has to pay the bills, and it has to be doable. We're also dealing with a lot of perceptions from the industry about carbon farming. There's been a lot of negative press about carbon farming, and this actually generates a situation where the potential adoption of carbon farming is not a very conducive environment, I guess, for adoption, because there are a lot of perceptions and misconceptions about carbon farming. And our role in government is also to try and work our way through what these are. Are there really some barriers? Are there things that are perceived to be barriers but really aren't? And how do we communicate that to industry? So these are just some of the perceptions that I've come across when I've been talking to producers through the Territory. Certainly the benefits and risks of undertaking a carbon farming project are very uncertain. There's not very many approved methodologies for doing carbon farming projects for the Northern Territory beef industry. The only way you can do a carbon farming project is to actually follow an approved methodology for a particular carbon farming practice, which is signed off by the federal government. Now, if that methodology is not in place, you cannot generate credits and be paid for those credits. So until such time as methodologies exist, people can't even participate. The pathway for implementation of an actual project on the ground on a pastoral station is really unclear, so people are not very keen to jump in without knowing what they're going to be in for or how to go about it. And there's some misconceptions getting around, and one that's, I guess, a very good example is that there's a misconception that if you do carbon farming, you can't do cattle production anymore. So there's been some examples where properties have been taken out of cattle production in order to do a carbon farming research project or to do carbon farming projects for carbon credits. But the reality is there is potential to have both those enterprises operating within a pastoral business. And of course, there's a lot of policy scepticism and even just beliefs around greenhouse gas emissions, climate change and things like that, which the industry has quite a lot of doubts about, and therefore, don't really want to buy into this space in the first place. So we're running a project in collaboration with the Queensland Department of Agriculture, Fisheries and Forestry. It's called the Climate Clever Beef Project, and we've actually already done some work in about the last 3.5 years in this space, and now we've got some more money from the federal government through their Action on the Ground program to continue some work and do this sort of really acid test approach to finding out whether there is this business case. And in the NT, the regions that we're actually doing this work in is the Barkly and the Victoria River District and the Douglas Daly. So you can see there just some of the facts and figures in terms of the land area that we're covering and also the number of cattle that presumably come under the influence of this project. We've got over 8 million hectares in the VRD in Douglas Daly with about 500,000 head of cattle. In the Barkly, it's about 16 million hectares and about 600,000 cattle that we can actually potentially influence through this work. So what are the carbon farming or greenhouse gas emissions reduction options that we're going to evaluate in this project? Well, there's two main options, I guess, two broad areas. The first one is to reduce livestock emissions. Now, remember I said at the start, 80% of emissions are actually attributable to the cattle. Most of these are from methane production. Now, methane is a byproduct of the digestion of feed in cattle. And the beauty about trying to reduce methane emissions is that by making feed conversion more efficient, not only are you reducing those methane emissions, but you're actually improving the productivity of the cattle that those emissions have been generated from. So there's that productivity and greenhouse gas emissions upside by reducing livestock emissions. And the sorts of practices that we're looking at are things like improving breeder herd efficiency, so the number of calves that are weaned per breeder mated over her lifetime. So we have actually quite a lot of inefficiency in our northern beef herds. There's actually, something like about 65% weaning rate is a fairly standard weaning rate in the northern cattle industry, and that's not very great, and there's a lot of room for improvement there. And the way that this is improved by increasing weaning rates is decreasing mortalities, particularly in the breeders, so in the mature breeders, managing the nutrition of those breeders well so that we reduce their mortality rates, managing stocking rates, so in those cases where stocking rates may be a bit higher than we'd like, if you can reduce those stocking rates back a bit, you actually reduce emissions because you have less cattle on your property in the first instance. But stocking rate management also has quite a large bearing on the nutrition of the cattle on the property. The more cattle you have, the more competition there is for feed and the less nutritious diet that those cattle can select if there's a lot of competition. So backing back on those stocking rates sometimes actually improves the diet quality for the cattle that are left behind and improves their performance. We're also looking at improving live weight gains in young cattle. So if we can grow cattle up to their market weight quicker, that will actually get those cattle off those properties earlier and reduce their lifetime emissions. If they're getting their heads chopped off at an earlier age, the total emissions that they've produced in their life is less than if we've had to carry them for another year, for example. And so decreasing the age of turn-off, there's several ways of doing this. One is to manage them on property for better nutrition, but there's also that option of taking those cattle somewhere else onto better quality pastures and finishing them elsewhere and getting them off quicker. So there's a whole bunch of things that we're looking at here around this livestock emissions business. The second broad area that we're looking at is carbon sequestration. And the sorts of practices that we're looking at there is trying to optimise land conditions, so making sure country's in good condition, so it's very productive, produces a lot of biomass for the rainfall that falls on it. And the main driver of land condition is grazing management, and particularly stocking rate management. Some of the other things that are obviously important in the north here is savanna burning, as I mentioned, is a major source of greenhouse gas emissions. So by minimising those really hot, destructive, late dry season fires, we can actually ensure that there's more carbon sequestration going on in that woody vegetation. But also there's current methodology approved for savanna burning to do with greenhouse gas abatement. So you may have heard there's a couple of projects been in the news recently, one at Fish River Station in the Douglas Daly and also at Tipperary Station in the Douglas Daly, and they have approved carbon farming projects under this savanna burning abatement methodology. Essentially what they've done is they've taken their burning regime from late in the year to earlier in the year when the emissions are lower, and the generation of the credits that has created then allows them to sell those credits to companies that need to buy them to offset their carbon tax liability. So savanna burning, there's two, I guess, options for carbon farming. One is the abatement side, but there is also potential down the track for a carbon sequestration benefit from good fire management and reducing the frequency of fires. One of the other ones is actually just taking really low pastoral country out of production. So currently you might have a few cows running around in a really low productivity paddock, piece of country that's very hard to muster, hardly produces any beef. It may actually be worthwhile for you, if you can generate money from carbon farming in that piece of country, not to run cattle in it at all. And there are some of the big pastoral country companies looking at this particular option by diversifying the land use on their property. And one that I haven't mentioned here, but is probably more relevant to places like Queensland, where some of my colleagues are working, is looking at carbon sequestration in regrowth management, where in the past there's been land clearing and that land is now being allowed to regenerate into woody vegetation, the carbon sequestration that's going into that woody vegetation. It's not so much of an issue for us. So how are we evaluating the business case exactly? There's two main steps that we're taking. The first thing to do is that we're working with actual real life producers in the Territory in Queensland. And I guess we just ask for people to volunteer to be part of this exercise, and thankfully we have got producers collaborating with us pretty easily. It wasn't too difficult. The first thing we do is we sit down with these producers and we benchmark their current situation. So we do a full sort of breakdown of what their current herd structure and performance is, what their financial situation is and how that business performs on a financial basis. We look at their current land condition and also do an estimate of the current emissions that have been generated by that business. And by doing that benchmarking process, we really do focus very much on the profit drivers in that business to work out if there is something going wrong in that business or there's opportunities to improve the performance of that business, what are the key levers that are in that business that can be tweaked to improve the overall business performance. And usually what happens is that the producer is quite confronted by some of the results that they see through the benchmarking process, but it's also very empowering because they start to think about some of the solutions to the problems they've got in their business, and they come up with a lot of the ideas for how that business could be improved. Quite often those improvements also happen to have these carbon farming or greenhouse gas emissions potential benefits as well. So we identify those potential improvements. There's usually a list of things and we prioritise them, usually based on their potential impact on improving the business, but also how practical they are to improve. Obviously, a lot of times when you improve something in a business that costs you money, there's no point the cost of that improvement outweighing the benefits you get back. The second step is then we actually do some modelling and sort of scenario testing and future forecasting to say, okay, if we implemented those changes that we've identified into this business, how would they perform in terms of all those things, in terms of the herd structure and performance and the financial performance, but also, of course, the emissions performance of the business. And we can look at all these different scenarios in different combinations and actually then give a bit of an output and a bit of a look-see to the business to say, well, if you did these things, these would probably give you better bang for your buck than if you did these things. So we run there's various models we use. They're all industry recognised models that have been around for a long time in the northern beef industry. I guess what's novel about what we're doing is that rather than using them in isolation, we have taken different models and integrated them into a package so we can actually look at the whole business in one sort of hit, which is fairly novel and it seems like common sense, but it's actually not been a very easy thing to do. And we're at a point now where we've got this thing rolling pretty well, and it's been used for a lot of other purposes now because we've actually managed to work out how to do it. So how does business as usual, if we kept doing what we're doing now, how would that compare to these improvement scenarios that have been identified? Then if we come up with a subset of some really great things that look very promising, are they even practical to do, let alone profitable or feasible? So it's all very well coming up with things that you could change in a business, but if they can't be implemented, then obviously adoption's not going to be very high. And we're also been doing on-property trialling of some of these promising options, and we're doing this in a sort of a double-pronged approach, I guess. We've actually started doing some on-ground trialling of things that we're pretty certain are going to have some bang for their buck and are probably going to come home to be useful. But we've also left ourselves the option of testing some of these new novel things that might come out of the modelling that we haven't even discovered yet. So I'll just give you a very quick overview of where we're doing the work in the territory on our case study properties. In the Barkly region, we're working at Alexandria, which is a very large property. It's privately owned by the NAPCO company and runs about 55,000 adult equivalents. It's a very big station. But the beauty about working at Alexandria is that this company and the manager that manages this property are really at the head of the curve in terms of the practices that they've been implementing on this property over the last 100 years of their ownership. The activities that we're doing here, we're doing a retrospective business analysis. So when I explained to you before how we do the benchmarking, what we typically do is we'll sit with a producer and say, here's where you're at now, what would you like to be doing, or where do you think this is going? And we go forward. In the case at Alexandria, they have made a lot of very significant changes to their business, say over the last 20 years in particular. So we're now actually going to reconstruct what they have already done to see whether we can go back to where they started and simulate the changes that they've made over the last 20 years. Because a lot of the practices that they're using are actually things that we'd like other people in the industry to be using, but they're not using them yet. So by being able to give some facts and figures around these practices for other producers, we're hoping that they will increase uptake of some of these practices that are going on in this property. The sorts of things that they have, that they're really, I guess, in terms of best practice, really at the top of the game. The things that we'll be looking at is how they've changed their stocking rate management over time, how the carrying capacity of that property has changed through infrastructure development, so the development of fences and waters in order to increase the number of cattle that they can carry, how they've improved live weight gain through various things that they've done on the place, looking at various aspects of cattle turn-off, so not only the number of cattle that are getting turned off per year, but also whether they've been able to reduce their age of turn-off, and also look at the weights of turn-off, so weight for age type information in terms of their marketing, and look at basic things about their breeder performance in terms of things like weaner percentages or brandy percentages and how they've changed over time. And the way that they've actually achieved a lot of these things is through animal selection, so doing things like pregnancy testing their females, and if a cow comes in and she's not pregnant and she should be, She doesn't get another chance. She goes on the truck to market, and only that drives a very strong selection pressure in that cow herd, and eventually the fertility of those herds improve out of sight because you've only got cows there that generate calves. They've also done a lot of work on genetics there, so they've changed from a shorthorn herd through a Brahman herd, and they now run cattle like this, which is their own stabilised composite, which is made up of several breeds, and they've chosen these breeds to come together into this composite to achieve certain aims in their cattle business. So they're looking at things like very high fertility, but also things like good live weight gain for age in order to suit the business model that they operate here. Their husbandry practices, how they've changed over time, things like when do they do their weaning, how do they manage their weaners, how do they manage their young heifers to give them the best possible start in life and the best fertility for their whole life. And then things like stocking rate management. These properties owned by NATCO have excellent stocking rate management. They really understand that stocking rate management drives animal nutrition and therefore animal performance. And a lot of the way they manage stocking rates is what we would like to see other people in the industry doing. So it's a really great place for us to do this work. We've also got a demonstration site on the ground already operating here. The demonstration site is really looking at how sustainable stocking rates and spelling country from grazing over the wet season can be used to manage land condition, and then what that means in terms of animal performance and land condition, and what that does for the pasture itself as practices to really optimise this nutrition, but also the underlying land condition on the property. So we're looking at measuring these various things, and we've been doing that since about 2010. Something that we started doing as just part of this project, we've got some money as part of the project to do some soil carbon sampling. So this year, Peter Shotton and I went down there in the very dry, freezing cold winter and did some soil sampling. And we're sampling soils in different land condition states to see whether in fact there is a correlation between soil carbon and land condition. It would seem logical that if you look after the land and there's a lot of litter going back into the soil and things, that soil carbon should be higher in good land condition. But from various sites across Northern Australia where this work's been done, the jury's still out. We have very inconsistent results in linking land condition to soil carbon. So this will be another site to add to that data set. Started it in 2010, and you see the man down there on the far right of the picture. He's the manager of Ross Peatling, and we made a commitment to him that we would monitor this trial for 10 years. So we've actually got quite a way to go yet. In the VRD, we're working with Livestock Station. It's about 5,000 square kilometres. It's owned by a private company, just a large sort of family operation, and it carries about 30,000 head. And the activities that we're looking at down there is they've actually been doing some pasture improvement there with legumes. So they've oversown legumes like stylos, for example, into their native pastures just to try and improve the diet quality in those pastures. Our pastures have very low quality in them after about June every year for the rest of the year until the wet season. So a way of improving the overall diet quality is to try and get legumes into the system. And it's quite common in places like the Douglas Daly, for example, to do this improved pasture stuff, but it's very uncommon in places like the VRD. And these people have got a lot of experience with legume pasture augmentation in other parts of Australia, and they decided to have a go at it here on their new property that they bought a couple of years ago. So the idea of it is to try and improve live weight gain, so get those young weaners onto this legume country, grow them a bit quicker, but also manage things like their heifers. So put their young heifers into these better paddocks so that they have good nutrition while they're growing, and hopefully that will set them up for better performance for their whole lives. But one of the other things that we're looking at too is something that Livestock started doing is actually taking a lot of their young cattle off to Queensland, where they have other properties that have much better pasture quality, and finishing those cattle over there and putting them through the domestic market. And there's actually, it's quite a number of benefits to do that for them. So they not only get the cattle off of Limbanya when the feed is sort of declining through the year and the feed quality is declining, but they also then can get those cattle turned off and finished off a lot quicker and into markets where they can get a higher price for them. It also reduces the stocking rate on Limbanya for a large portion of the year, which means that the cattle left behind then have higher diet quality and better nutrition. Property where we're working in the Douglas Dale is Ruby Downs. It's a fairly small property in territory standards, I guess, but it's a reasonable size for the Douglas Dale. About half of it's actually under improved pastures, and what they do there is that they take feeder cattle from more extensive parts of the territory. So some of the bigger stations will breed the weaners, and the weaners will come up, or they'll be on the stations for a little while, and then they'll come up to the Douglas Dale. So they arrive in about November each year at about 220 kilograms, and then they grow those cattle out to live export weight over the wet season. The other practices that they do, or the other enterprises they have, I should say, they produce a lot of hay, and they also have leased some of their country out to sandalwood operations, so they have income from that as well. And the things that we're doing in the project at Ruby Downs, we're looking across the range of different things that they're doing there. We're looking at what the livestock emissions are off those various pieces of country. So if you run your cattle in your non-improved country, what are their emissions? If you run it in your improved country, what are the emissions implications of that? But also looking at the soil carbon sequestration potential under the different countries. So country that's been cleared, country that's been improved, country that's in its native state, under all these different management systems, whether it be continuous grazing or cell grazing, like high intensity grazing. Does the soil carbon change under those different management practices, and under which practices would you expect to get better carbon sequestration? And the work that David Folks and Peter Schotten are doing in the Douglas Dale here is actually being compared to a lot of other work they've been doing on other properties down there, looking at these very things under different management regimes on different properties. So they've got quite a large body of work coming together, and Ruby Downs will just add to that when they're doing that through this project. I just wanted to run you through, I guess, a bit of a taste of a scenario analysis and what we've done as an example. And I've produced this in order to present a poster at the Northern Beef Research Update Conference that was held in Cairns a couple of months ago, and it went down reasonably well in the poster. I just hope I can do it justice in a PowerPoint presentation. So the scenario we're looking at, and the background data for this did come from Limbanya, the case study property, so it's actually based on real life property data, but we then built a model that wasn't quite Limbanya, so we looked at sort of a typical property and a typical rainfall area and applied their sort of information to our model. So the scenario we're looking at, about 2.5 square K breeder property that produces cattle that are then finished off at the 350 kilo live export market. The scenario that we investigated was to increase weaning rates. Remember I said that the average weaning rates can sort of be about 60 to 65% in these businesses. That's pretty typical, and there's room for improvement, and it's not unrealistic to improve it. So this is a scenario that actually has real life opportunity. How are we going to do this? We're going to reduce stocking rate by about 5%, which in the scheme of things is not very much at all. What we've assumed in this property is it's just a little bit overstocked. It's probably running a few more than it really should be for its current sort of carrying capacity. So we're just going to back that off a little bit. One of the ways of achieving that will be to cull some of the unproductive breeders. So do the preg testing. If they're not in calf, they go on the truck, and over time your average fertility in your breeder herd will improve. But you may also have to sell other cattle in order to achieve the 5% reduction in stocking rate. But the unproductive breeders will give you a fairly big bang for your buck in trying to achieve that stocking rate reduction in the first instance. We actually get to practice best practice in terms of weaning. We're not going to let weaners stay on the cows all year or until late in the dry season. We're going to get them off in the first round, and we're going to look after those weaners very well by feeding them weaner supplement in the yards and getting them set up and putting them into good paddocks when they are taken off mum. We're going to run our heifers in better quality paddocks. We're not going to stick them out in the scrub out the back and just hope for the best. We're going to put them in paddocks that have good quality pastures. And instead of just culling all of our cull cows the day they hit 10 years of age, we're actually going to be a little bit strategic because we can't just keep hacking into our stocking rate. We will keep a portion of these cows if they come into the yards and we find they're healthy, they've got enough teeth to keep staying on the place and eating, and they're preg tested and in calf. So they've already got a calf on board. We might as well keep them and get that calf from them this year. So these are all things that are all very doable by your average producer, and they don't cost a lot of money. Now, when we run the scenario through our models, for this modelling, I used a model called Breed Cow and Dynama, which is a northern beef industry herd model. These are some of the before and afters figures. And so you can see how we've reduced the stocking rate in terms of adult equivalents has come down from about 16,600 to below 16,000. So we've got less cattle and we've upped the average weaning rate to something quite reasonable. Remember I said 65%, in our scenario it was 58%, which was based on real life cattle data from a real property. By doing the practices that I mentioned in terms of the early weaning and things, we've upped that weaning rate. One of the big things is the weaning. If you take those weaners off that cow, it retains her in good body condition and it increases her opportunity to recycle and reconceive. So body condition is a major driver of reconception rates in the north. If you don't take those weaners off, that body condition slips and the reconception rates decline. So this is how we're getting some of the improvement in weaning rate. Seeing those second calvers have very low reconception rates, and that's because those young heifers are not only trying to produce a calf and grow a calf, but they're also still growing themselves. So there's a huge energy demand on them. And so when it comes to having their second calf, they just can't even get pregnant because they're not in good enough body condition to conceive. So by looking after those heifers better, we put them in the better paddocks, we weaned their calf early, we're getting much better weaning rates out of those second calves as well. We've actually weaned more calves even though we've got less breeders, and that's because we've improved the weaning rate. So a lot of people are worried about reducing stocking rate because they say we won't produce as many calves. But the reality is if you're a little bit overstocked, you can reduce your stocking rate and actually produce more calves because the cows have had better nutrition. Breeder mortality rates have reduced a little bit from 5% to 3%, and that's through managing that body condition and taking those weaners off and giving those cows the best possible chance to survive the long dry season that they have to go through. And the live weight sold per year has gone up a little bit through the extra weaners that you've produced. You're producing extra cull cows, but also the average weights of the cattle that are left behind are a little bit higher at sale because you've managed the stocking rate well. How much greenhouse gas emissions do these herds produce? Well, total emissions in the original property was just over 31,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. These numbers blow people away when we talk about these in Canberra. They just can't come to grips with the sheer size of the numbers of emissions that are generated. We've actually managed to reduce those total emissions because we've reduced stocking rate. So essentially that just reduces directly in line with stocking rate reduction. In terms of the efficiency of the greenhouse gas emissions produced per tonne of live weight sold, of course that reduces because not only have we reduced the amount of methane emissions being produced, but we've also got a slight increase in that live weight being sold off property, so it dilutes the emissions as well. So that's where you generate your carbon credit. If there's an approved methodology that says those practices are approved to generate carbon credits, you've now generated just over 2,500 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent that theoretically you could sell to someone who wants to buy them and generate money. So what do the financial results say? For those of you that don't know what gross margin is, Essentially, gross margin is a relative indicator of profit in a business, and it's worked out by taking the total amount of money or the total income that comes into a business and deducting off the direct costs that have been generated to actually come up with that income. So basically, the total income minus the direct costs is all the costs except for the overheads in the business. And it basically it tells us in this scenario that even though we had to put some costs into, or some extra costs into the business to look after our weaners, for example, those costs were more than offset by the additional income that the business generated by having more cattle to sell or more kilos to sell. So we've made more money, or the gross margin of this business has improved, and the gross margin per adult equivalent has improved in direct response. Those two things sometimes don't happen. It takes quite a lot of work. You'd think that sometimes it'd be a no-brainer that if you produce more cattle, you're going to make more money, but of course it is very sensitive to costs. And if your costs go up over the income that you produced, your gross margin will not improve at all. In fact, sometimes it goes backwards. So in terms of earnings before interest and tax, just for the cattle enterprise, so regardless of any carbon business that we might get into, we have actually made more profit in this business just through those changes. Even though we had less cattle, we've made more money, which is a good news story. So what's the potential carbon income then from the methane abatement? Well, it depends what the price of carbon is. And there's a fair bit of uncertainty around that at the moment. And so I guess produce some figures that would give you an indication of what that carbon or that methane abatement would be worth. So at $5 a tonne, it's only going to generate about $12,000 of additional income to your business. But if it's $25 a tonne, it's $60,000 a year to that business. And because it's an abatement project, you can generate that abatement year after year after year. So if you can show that your stocking rates could have been this, but they are now this, and you're managing it in this way, you can generate that credit into the future however long you like. It's a bit different to a sequestration project where if you're storing carbon in vegetation, for example, there's only a certain amount of carbon that can be stored in that vegetation, and it has to be retained at the moment for 100 years. So you get paid a proportion every year for the 100-year life of that project. And you can't just claim additional credits on top all the time. You have to retain the credits you've generated for 100 years. So if something happened to that carbon stock, say it got burnt by a bushfire or something, that actually generates a liability because you've lost the carbon stock, and it becomes a liability to your business. And the beauty about abatement projects is once you've got the credit, it's there, it's done, you've got it, you don't have to ever pay it back, you can't take it off. If you don't happen to make an abatement credit the next year, you just don't get paid for it. That's essentially what happens. So you don't get penalised, you just don't get paid if you don't generate it. I wanted to point out here with these potential carbon income figures too that that's the gross income from the project. So that doesn't take into account your administration costs, your setup costs, the auditing costs. So they're a bit uncertain. We don't really know how much they are, but at $5 a tonne, I'd be pretty certain that that would be pretty much fully eroded by the administration and audit costs for one of these projects. So you'd need to be getting much better than that at the current time to make it worthwhile. Right, so what are our current recommendations to the Northern Territory cattle industry about this? Well, obviously do your sums. We've done lots and lots of models and lots of scenarios, and we can generate lots and lots of outcomes, but they're very sensitive to price, not only for the cattle performance side or the cattle business performance, but also obviously the carbon project will be very sensitive to carbon price. I guess our key recommendation at the moment is don't just go chasing carbon income. It's not going to be the silver bullet that solves all your cash flow problems in your business. But if you can find improvements that are going to benefit your cattle enterprise, and they do happen to have potential as carbon farming project material down the line, then that could be really a positive thing down the track if we can get some of these methodologies up and approved. You have to obviously consider that we don't know what the carbon price is going to be in the future, and once it goes to a floating market, if we go down that line in Australia, it could be anywhere between $2 a tonne and $200 a tonne. We've got no idea really, so there's a big risk in that for people setting up these projects. One of the other issues is that there's not very many methodologies approved by the federal government that can be applied in the Northern Territory beef industry at the moment. The stocking rate scenario I told you about, there's actually work being done on a methodology along those lines at the moment by the federal government, but it's not approved yet, and it's probably a long way down the track before it will be. It might be a year or two away. One of the, I guess, few methodologies that has been approved and is being used is that savanna burning methodology. But that only applies in the rainfall zone above 1,000 millimetres per annum. So sort of north of Katherine, only or businesses or properties in that area qualify for that methodology. There is a methodology being developed for the 600 mil to 1,000 mil rainfall zone, and that will probably be endorsed perhaps next year at this stage. So whilst there are some methodologies around, there's not many, and they don't apply to the vast bulk of producers that we're dealing with. And finally, as I mentioned before, the admin and audit costs really need to be factored into any carbon farming project. And at the moment, for the early adopters, they're having to wear all those costs themselves. But down the track, there is an idea that there'll be sort of cooperatives of landowners get together to do projects on a broader geographical scale, and then they can share those audit and admin costs amongst themselves and dilute those costs. So where are we going from here? This Climate Clever Beef project is funded by the federal government until June 2015. So between now and then we have to deliver a few things. Obviously we're going to end up with a short list of potentially promising practices that not only benefit cattle businesses but have potential as carbon farming projects. We're very much going to document what those productivity and efficiency benefits might be to the business in particular, so the cattle business. We need to have a handle on how sensitive those improvements are to things like changes in cattle prices or other things like carbon price, for example, if it's carbon projects. So in carbon farming projects, we want to be able to say by the end of the project under what conditions that carbon farming project would be viable for a business to enter into. But we also want to say under what conditions would it not be viable. So for example, if carbon was $5 a tonne, this sort of project will not be viable, or it will be viable if the price is $17 a tonne and higher. Those sorts of sensitivity analyses around whether people should buy in or not, and give them, I guess, a bit of a risk profile for these practices. And of course, we're hoping by working with collaborators on the ground out in the industry, how we can give the rest of the industry some practical tips on how you might integrate a carbon farming project into an operating cattle enterprise, and what sort of traps and pitfalls there might be in doing that. So I just want to acknowledge the funding from the Australian Government Department of Agriculture as part of its Action on the Ground program. And we're just about there. If anyone needs any more information about the project, they can contact me. David Folkes and Peter Shotton are also working on this project in our department if you want to have a yarn to them. And yeah, it's ready for questions if anyone has any.